I think a lot of the times, whenever we're analyzing fighters, looking at their records, looking at their past performances, in order to try and get a grasp on their future performances, I think most people, by and large, or at least most people I see online anyway, tend to put too much weight off of big names. And basically, as the title says, because I know how I'm gonna title this, that bigger names doesn't equal better wins. It's all pretty much right there. Bigger names doesn't necessarily equal better wins. I see a lot of people going into this Nicholas Walters fight with Vasyl Lomachenko, talking about, oh well, Walters' best wins are they're just smaller guys. It was Nonito Donaire and Victor Chinian, two guys that started their title run at flyweight. Eventually wound up at featherweight, where Walters, of course, manhandled him and knocked him out. But that being said, even though they were big names, yes, they were very well known in the United States, in the Anglosphere, the English speaking world. There are other fighters that could arguably, and very easily arguably, be considered better wins or just better performances by virtue of how Walters did in them against fighters who were simply better, period. Like better in terms of a head to head basis. Jason Sosa, most people thought that Nicholas Walters won that fight, including myself. Of course, he got a majority draw. But put Jason Sosa in there against Nonito Donaire or Victor Chinian, either one of them, I'm picking Sosa by knockout against both of them. Against both of them very easily. So, technically speaking, a better win would be Jason Sosa, even though he didn't necessarily have the name value behind him the way that Donaire and Darchinian did going into their fights with Walters. Of course, Sosa's his overall gravitas is definitely increased since that fight, considering the fact that managed to knock out Javier Fortuna and his most recent performance as well. But there, and then outside of Jason Sosa, even Miguel Mariaga. Nicholas Walters, of course, missed weight for the Mariaga fight, so he was, a bigger man fighting a, slightly smaller guy. I don't want to necessarily say that like, oh my God, Mariaga was so much smaller. Um, but once again, Mariaga is a guy that was a big puncher, a guy that dropped Walter. I mean, not dropped, stunned Walters a couple of times, and Walters, of course, was able to drop him and eventually get a decision over him. Just kind of just overall outskilling him over, from a general perspective. But Mariaga was very much in that fight, and of course, Mariaga had a recent win, a pretty impressive knockout victory over Guy Robb, who was a fellow top level contender, a fellow top 10 guy, basically at 130 pounds or 126 pounds rather. So Mariaga's another guy that I would pick over Donaire and Darchinian both. He's a hard puncher, guy with a good chin, good volume, good punch variety. And even before Walters ever fought Donaire and Darchinian, he had a fight with a guy by the name of Dallas Prescott, with a name, of course, that some of you may consider familiar by virtue of Brady's Prescott. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Dallas Prescott is actually Brady's Prescott's little brother. They have the same they have like the same name, um, what do you call it, like name pattern, basically, like Dallas Prescott Consegra, and Brady's Prescott something Consegra. So just in the Spanish naming custom, you tend to put your both your father and your mother's um, last names in there, just to by virtue of showing a tributary to both lineages of the family. But that's a total aside. But in any case, Dallas Prescott, of course, just like his brother Brady's, big puncher, a guy that was more of a natural featherweight, if not a natural super featherweight, a guy that outside of the Nicholas Walters fights, his only other losses came above featherweight. They came at super feather or even lightweight. He had a knockout loss earlier this year to Saul Neno Rodriguez, seventh round knockout loss to him at lightweight. It was basically a catch weight. It was 132 and a half for both of them. But once again, Saul Rodriguez, is a top level contender at lightweight. In my opinion, one of the best non-champions in that division. A guy that's really set to blow up as soon as they manage to get him a big fight. A guy that knocked out in one round. A guy that took Felix Verdejo the full 12 in Bam Bam. What was his name? Bam Bam Najera. Ivan Najera. Bam Bam Najera. But in any case, Walters, of course, just like that. Mariaga, to me, the Sosa win are definitely head and shoulders above the Donaire and Darchinian wins. The Prescott win could theoretically be argued against either of those. I mean, of course, after fighting Walters, Darchinian hasn't really done very much. He got slept in his last fight, or at least the last fight that I saw. I'm not sure if he's had a fight since then, but he got put completely out cold against Sergio Frias. And actually, I think that was a super bantamweight fight, if I'm not mistaken. And then Darnaire, of course, since then, he racked up a solid win against Cesar Juarez. Was a top level contender at 122 pounds back at super bantamweight, but then pretty much got schooled and almost got you know like hurt real bad. Almost it looked like he was on his way to being stopped in the ninth or 10th round against Diego Magdaleno. Or yeah, Diego Magdaleno. Thought I was mixing, or no, was it Jesse? No, it was Jesse Magdaleno. I always mix those two brothers up, man. But yeah, Jesse Magdaleno managed to school Donaire and beat his ass. Basically, it's kind of funny that they're actually talking about a rematch between those two, because I think Jesse actually will possibly stop him in the second fight and potentially beat him a lot worse. I don't know how anybody saw that fight even close. Donaire looked like a fucking alien after that shit was done. But in any case, that's just another case right there. To think of some other examples, Tyson Fury, for instance. Tyson Fury, of course, the biggest name on his record, the biggest name on his resume, the guy that he beat and beat most impressively, Vladimir Klitschko. But was that his toughest fight? Was that necessarily his most impressive performance? Yeah, I mean, you could say that in a certain manner. But I'd say that the Steve Cunningham fight, you could technically argue against that by virtue of the fact that Cunningham gave him a little bit more resistance. I mean, even Derek Chisora gave him more resistance. But I like the Cunningham fight a little bit more because I'd say Fury was more in shape for that. Whereas with Chisora, I thought Fury looked like he was in awful shape. He was definitely in some other planet in terms of training camp as he prepared for that fight. But with Cunningham, Cunningham of course dropped him and he adjusted to him and beat his ass, knocked him out, and that was all there was to it. So I mean, you can make an argument for that. You can make an argument for some other fights too. I'm trying to think of some other ones. I mean, in a large part of a lot of these guys' careers, they'll fight guys that necessarily aren't the biggest names, but they are better fighters and they give stiffer opposition than some of the bigger names that some of these guys are fighting, by virtue of the fact that some of the bigger names are, oftentimes either worn out by the time the A side or the A side big name fighter, the guy that actually beats them, is finally coming across them, or the fact that some of these smaller name guys necessarily haven't necessarily made a name for themselves and are basically on their way up to making a name for themselves. I mean, like obviously, for instance, Roman Gonzalez, Brian Valoria, going into all of the fights that he's ever had, was probably the biggest name guy that he had ever really fought. Brian Valoria and probably Edgar Sosa. Both of them really didn't provide as much of a challenge, anywhere near as much of a challenge as Juan Francisco Estrada, Francisco Rosas, or Carlos Cuadras did. Of course, those three really make up the trifecta of the three tough fights that Gonzalez has had. I guess you can make an argument too for Rosas in the second fight. He gave Gonzalez a hell of a first round until Gonzalez sparked him out in the second. But still, once again, just guys that weren't necessarily the biggest name guys going into the fights became really the best wins for Gonzalez coming out of the fights in an emphatic fashion. I think you could go down the list of a lot of different fighters, really, and find much of the same thing. Sergey Kovalev with Isaac Chilemba. Kovalev was definitely the biggest name value guy, and guy that was, as far as when Chilemba fought them, a guy that was very much the highest ranked pound for pound, and in the light heavyweight sense as well, going into that fight. But did he give Chilemba his worst beating? No. Vosdik just did that. He definitely gave Chilemba the worst beating. He beat his ass and stopped him. Of course, he had a little bit of a rocky start, but most people have a rocky start and really a rocky fight as a whole against Isaac Chilemba. He's not an easy guy to fight. Vosdik, made it look fairly easy by comparison to pretty much every other top flight, either prospect or champion that Chilemba's ever fought. So, I mean, it just goes to show, just because you're a bigger name doesn't necessarily mean doesn't necessarily equal a better performance or a better, just like a better, I guess you might call it a resume booster, a better, highlight insofar as somebody's overall quality is concerned. And I think that a lot of these lesser known fights are a big factor in terms of actually trying to judge a fighter's quality, because a lot of the times some of these guys will have styles that are very particular that a certain fighter may fight again, and may potentially have trouble with in the future. Whereas I think a lot of the bigger name fighters, oftentimes they have a very particular style that's unto themselves. It's very unique unto themselves, whereby they get by sometimes on more athleticism than overall technical skills, technical ability, and that lack of technical ability, or sometimes even just punching power, just size and strength, makes a difference in comparison to having just the overall like speed and agility. Of course, the Donero was the most flashy, agile type of guy that Walters had faced. Yes, but that flashiness and agility means nothing in comparison to just the thudding raw power and just aggression and stamina that Jason Sosa is able to throw bombs at you for the full 12 rounds. It was able to score a comeback knockout over Fortuna in the late rounds. Was still throwing bombs in his last fight against Steven Smith in the late rounds. Miguel Mariaga, another guy that was, very heavy-handed guy. He doesn't necessarily have to be throwing a flashy punch where you see him putting his entire body into it to really hurt you. He's a guy that just has that natural leverage where even if he throws, if he like hits you, he's one of those guys that if he kind of like backhands you like open-handedly, like if you're hanging out with him or something, he like kind of hits you to get your attention. You're like, oh shit, like that guy packs some power. Imagine if he hit you with a full fist, fully leveraged. He has that type of power. Just a heavy-handed son of a bitch. He's the power is there, regardless of whether he's really putting a lot behind it or not. So I mean, that was just pretty much my piece that I wanted to say on that. I think that there's a lot of different instances of this that go on, just generally speaking, in terms of flashy guys versus flashy names versus guys that fighters sometimes have to dig a little bit deeper against, even if they're not necessarily the toughest opponents. I mean, shit, Miguel Cotto, all the way back when he fought Ricardo Torres. Torres was not a name value guy by any means. But until the Margarito fight, of course, Torres gave Cotto one of his toughest fights, and to this day, I think that's one of the most exciting fights that Cotto was ever in. And honestly, like if I want to show somebody the greatness that was Miguel Cotto, that's definitely probably the first fight I want to show him, just by virtue of the fact that he fought through adversity and managed to knock out Torres after getting rocked a number of times, early and often. Just a fantastic fight, and another example of just going back in the pages a little bit. So I mean, that's pretty much all there is to it, and there you have it. And I'm done with this video. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Peace.